want to talk? So let's talk. Here. Talk. You want to talk? You gotta talk, you need to talk. News talk.
I talk, you talk to Solomon. I talk, you talk to Solomon. Yeah, let's talk to Solomon. Talk to Solomon.
You gotta talk.
Good evening, and welcome to Talk to Solomon. That's me, Stan Solomon, my co-host.
Chief Steve.
And my friend Brent Johnson. Our guest, Dr. Alan Keyes. Dr. Keyes, how are you tonight? Do we have Alan?
Hello?
Right. Yes, Alan, now we have you. How are you tonight?
I said I'm doing pretty well. Good evening, Chief.
Good evening.
This is an August time, and we have this very esteemed panel of Brent Johnson, Chief Steve, Dr. Alan Keyes, and me, as we join the Florida Planned Parenthood in celebrating National Masturbation Month. I'm not exactly sure how we're supposed to start this celebration, but Dr. Keyes, where has our society gone when, and let me quote, so I'm not accused of saying something mean, National Masturbation Month is part of a common and safe kind of sex play with many health benefits. After all, that's how we got the president. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed to say that. Dr. Keyes.
Well, Stan, I think sadly, once you have started down a road where you're no longer paying any attention to what the function is, what the ultimate aim and purpose is of our human existence, I think these kinds of things become more and more frequent, inevitable. They are a reflection of the understanding that is behind a lot of what is now going on in terms of the degradation, really, of human sexuality and sexual behavior. And it all traces its root back, at the end of the day, to two things, I think. One, the view that we're just animals here by accident who happen to have certain traits and characteristics, but in other respects are no different than the rest of the animal kingdom, or for that matter, the inanimate universe. That means that all of the sensibilities that were once associated with human procreation are just that. They're superficial, and they should be done away with, while these folks move down a road in which, in a very pragmatic way, you look at human beings the same way you'd look at, I don't know, dogs and cats and other things, solely in terms of whatever may be your politically correct ideological purpose. Within the case of a lot of these folks is, as we're increasingly learning, an understanding of the universe that kind of looks on us as if we're a burden to the universe, and it would be better if we weren't around. And so if you encourage people not to procreate and to look upon human sexuality in a way that has nothing to do with it, you serve the purposes of ultimately reducing and perhaps extinguishing the human race. And you think I'm exaggerating, but I was reading this week that, for instance, a Catholic university, DePaul, invited a speaker. Professor Wilson used to be a guy who looked at ants, and now he looks at human beings as if they're ants. And he was being honored, and he's someone who has basically written that human beings are a curse on the face of the earth, that Christianity is the worst kind of belief system that you could possibly have, and that the world would be better off if there had never been any human beings. And I think that degradation of who we are is reflected in this understanding that is then connected with the notion that we kind of evolved by accident from slime, and that we do not reflect the will and purpose of an intentional creator who gave us a status in the universe, who, for whose sake our intelligence and understanding exist, and for whose sake they ought to be applied to the activities of our human life, so that we will properly reflect not just the nature at large, but the special human nature that he shared with us. Final point, Stan, I always like to draw this connection because I think it's very important in the context of America. Once you have gotten to the point where you're looking at these kinds of assumptions about humanity, it is not only human sexuality that's degraded, it is, of course, the ideas of human justice and right and wrong, until at the end of the day, you get back to a view of things that is essentially like looking at animals in a jungle. And since we're no different than that, we follow the same rules. And so you don't look at preying on the weak and things like this as if there's anything wrong with it. That's just the way things are. And so the whole notion of justice that underlies American society is thrown out the window as well.
Brent, your thoughts?
Well, my first thought is that I think that in the best spirit of educational integrity, Professor Wilson should set the example. If he believes that humans are a plague on the earth, he should set the example for all of us by removing himself from the gene pool. Having said that, Alan, it's always great to hear you. I am always educated and entertained listening to you. And back in ancient Greece, I am reminded by what you said. Back in ancient Greece, they used to have philosophers on street corners, and they would talk about the meaning of life, the purpose of humanity. And people would gather around and they would just listen, and there would be dialogues and discussions about these all important issues. In sophisticated, high technology societies today, philosophical discourse is considered to be, oh, well, we don't have time for that kind of stuff. That's just philosophy. It's poo-pooed. It's made into something unimportant. After all, it's not going to make you money. After all, it's not going to help you climb the corporate ladder. And after all, that's what life is about. I think that we are missing something very, very dear to human existence, in that we have indeed discounted the philosophical discourses of, among others, the ancient Greeks about what life is for and why we are here. And frankly, I think that we would all do well if we could refocus at least some of our attention on those key issues.
Well,
Go ahead.
one of the assumptions of that discourse, of course, had to start with the one that Aristotle made, that there is nous, or mind, in things, right? That the universe isn't just here as a result of some kind of happenstance and accident, but that in fact it reflects and embodies the activities of a rational being, right? With purpose and intention, reflecting in fact that purpose and intention. You can't have discussions about the ultimate aim, purpose, or function in the absence of that assumption that there is a mind at work. Remove it, and it just becomes kind of a chaotic mess, and we are what we are, and whatever is what it is, and you just make the best of it while you're here, and there are no particular rules, and so forth and so on. So philosophic discourse of that kind does become irrelevant in the context of that kind of chaos.
Well said. Chief?
Well, Stan, I think this story is a trick. Planned Parenthood is in the process. They're in the business of killing unborn babies, at least half of which are women and most are black. And so what they do with a story like this, in my opinion, is they throw out this story, get us discussing whether or not they should be discussing and or promoting children having masturbation techniques, when we should be discussing how to stop Planned Parenthood and put them out of business forever.
And many states are doing exactly that, and I couldn't agree with you more. Speaking of Planned Parenthood, we have a man who's not participated in that discussion. He's 33 years old, he lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, and his name is Desmond. Desmond has fathered 30 children with 11 different women. He makes minimum wage. He pays $1.75 per week per child, and he went to court to ask that the judge reduce his child support, as he doesn't have any money left, I guess, for condoms. Now, well, I'm just going to hand it off to Dr. Keys, because who I know will make a speech on this. I just interested where it's going to go.
My wife and I were talking about this the other day, and it is one of those times, Stan, when it's tempted to suggest that certain kinds of direct action might be appropriate in this case. Because it seems to me that connection between human activity, human rights, and a little thing called responsibility. Remember, we were talking about that last week? This, I think, is a good example of how we've totally severed that connection. And all joking aside, this would be far less tragic if we weren't looking at an extreme case of what is in fact now an epidemic problem in the urban communities, the black community. I mean, this business of, what do they call it, Stan? Concubining, right? and essentially men who are irresponsibly having children and planting their kind of wild oats in this place and that place and the other. And this is an illustration of the simple fact that doing that, you can pretend that somehow or another you can tolerate that, and you're still going to be promoting somehow a decent relationship between that father and the child, because we're going to have these courts and they're going to force child support and so forth. But that is no longer looking at the truth of the situation. And in fact, having allowed that degree of irresponsibility, you have a problem that then can only be resolved by implication, by having the government take over the sustenance of this man's children. We're sort of taking baby steps, Stan, back toward what was, I think, the common sense of human societies, supposedly far less sophisticated than ours, down through many centuries. Maybe we're rediscovering why it is that so much time and attention was paid in every society worthy of the name, anywhere on earth, to the business of making sure that family was taken seriously, that it wasn't just allowed to chaotically take place by happenstance and mere lust, but that every society developed some structure wherewith to make sure that the consequences of family would be dealt with in a responsible way. We're now trying this experiment of departing from what has been that common sense of all humanity, and I think this story illustrates in a kind of ludicrous way that has a serious point that this is failing.
I would ask you, Brent, to address the issue that not only do we have a guy who has a type of gun will travel, but we have 11 different women who didn't care, who don't care, who provided him with an opportunity to procreate, and that they have neither the pride nor the responsibility of wanting to provide for their children and establish their own value. Could you comment, please?
Yes, and that's exactly what I was going to comment on, because I think that is the other portion of this issue. It's very easy to say this man fathered 30 or 33 children or whatever. That's easy to say. But there were, 11 different women with whom he fathered these children. And you must assume, now I don't know for sure, but I would have to assume that some, if not all of these women, wanted the children, at least in part, because of benefits. The more children you get, the more welfare benefits you get. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for every one of them. I could be completely wrong with all of them. But in a society in which the value systems have made money the most important factor, it's not totally surprising that some people will seek to get money through procreation. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if that was part of the motivation. It may be that from the guy's standpoint, somehow or other in his hood, in his community, he gets to be a big man because he's, concubining all these women. Okay, it may be from the women's perspective, he's actually helping them to survive because they have 3-4 children apiece, or however many they have, and each child is getting them another paycheck from the government, ultimately from you and me and Alan and the chief and the taxpayers out there. And the problem comes because that value system is so distorted. If you reset, what Alan said is correct. If you reestablish a value system where morals and family values come first, then this kind of stuff gets stopped in its tracks. And by the way, just a comment, our republic was formed, according to Ben Franklin, for a just and moral people. He went on to say, it is insufficient to any other. Well, today we have unjust and immoral people, not only in government, but among the population. And that is why these things happen. These are all symptoms of a disease. And the disease is our value systems and our morality, or lack of it.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's all exactly correct. And I think we also need to notice, however, and every time I see something like this, runs through my mind the episode that happened when I was a freshman in college, where you had folks coming in to a, what was it called then? The Afro-American Society or something like that. And these were these leftist speakers who were coming in to talk to us. And they were actually giving messages that were to encourage black folks to think of prostitutes and pimps and all these people as typical, hearing things about how you had to work with people in the poor community so they would no longer resist the idea of going on welfare because they met a lot of resistance to this. It reminds me, Stan, that this collapse, this corruption, is actually due to the demagogic nature of our politics, to people seeking power who invent these destructive ideas, show up in front of people's doorsteps and saying, we're going to help you by taking your responsibility on to the government and taking care of your kids and so forth. And when people say, no, we're ashamed of that, you actually send in psychologists and all of these people to break down their resistance to your help so that they will obligingly enter into your arena of dependency. So I don't think we should forget that this kind of corruption has been worked systematically to the advantage of those in the elites who basically are building their power base by encouraging the dependency of our people, by corrupting their morals, and by ultimately, I think, making us unfit to maintain a system of self-government. So we'll have to move toward an elite-dominated totalitarian socialism. And that's exactly where we're headed.
Yes.
No question at all. Now, Chief, you've been on the street. You've seen how it's impacted people. Is that at your end? Someone's phone? Okay. At any rate, can you comment on the environment that would encourage this type of thing? I've never heard the term concubining. I guess I'm too old, but I know it now.
Well, the environment starts at the top in this case, and I'm hoping that the left is having heartburn because they could have had 11 women testifying for free contraceptives instead of one Harvard law student. But if Brent is correct, and these women have had these children to get more benefits, then that's also worked against Planned Parenthood because they didn't abort these babies. So that's a good thing. But the morality of this starts at the top. And so we have got this. This is just a big problem that we've all got to address and speak out about this as often as we can. But the goal was to break down the traditional American family. And so in the end process, I'm glad these children are alive, but they've been denied now the traditional marriage of a husband and a mother, a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, which has been proven to be very, very good for children, to give them a much better environment. So the fact that the government itself has promoted this type of an environment and keeps promoting it is disastrous to our society, because the traditional family is the backbone, the glue that holds our society together. We must get back to that and speak out about those good things that happen when a man and a woman create a family.
In love.
Yes.
In love. All right, now, I want to start another discussion, but it's really not another discussion. Now, listen to this, folks. I believe that we are seeing an attempt to, and Alan brought the point in, to say that to think morally, to think logically, to think patriotically, to think godly, there is something wrong with you. But to think amorally or immorally, to think irresponsibly, to think selfishly, you're normal. So the question becomes, how do we, even though we're going to be called names and all of us have been there, how do we do our part to show enough love, some would call it tough love, to say, if you are living on welfare because you want to, not because you have to, if you are offering yourself to anyone, everyone, and all ones because you don't care or you want to, not because you were forced or you're desperate, you're wrong, you're bad, you're the problem. How do we do that? Dr. Keys.
Well, Stan, the only way you're going to do that is by actually thinking through and adopting once again the understanding that encourages a responsible attitude, first toward ourselves and then toward our community and the rest of the world. But right now, our elite is encouraging a most peculiar combination when it comes to responsibility. because you do realize, Stan, that we have massive campaigns paid for with multi-millions of dollars going out into all of the schools and everywhere to brainwash our children about their responsibility for the earth. You know that, right? So we want every individual to feel responsibility for the snail darter's extinction, but not for themselves. Don't you think that's kind of odd? That you would encourage people to believe they can be responsible for the universe, which is God's job, by the way, and yet they can't take responsibility for themselves. That's what we're doing. That's what we're purposefully doing in our so-called educational system. And so you get an outcome that is exactly what you prepare. It's like people who get this awful tasting food, and the reason it's awful tasting is because the recipe and the ingredients are put together to make that happen. And I think it's time we woke up, Stan. We need to stop fooling ourselves with the thought that this kind of destruction of family and responsibility and of the spiritual and moral underpinnings that are required to sustain these things, that this is happening by accident. I want to reiterate the point I made at the end of my last statement. I think this is all being purposefully done, precisely because when the country was founded, the founders actually wanted democratic, that is, by the people, self-government to work. Our present elites don't want it to work because they want to return to governments in which an elite few dominate and control all the rest. So while I read the statement by the founders that said, this Constitution is framed for a moral and a religious people, it is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. And I said, that's a guideline for what we need to be emphasizing. Maintaining the spirit of faith, maintaining the educational system that teaches people the importance of the moral and of personal responsibility and so forth. You do realize there are people who read that and said, oh, so that's the weakness. If we can break down the character, then this thing that has been working so well that it produced the greatest nation in the history of the world can be undermined and destroyed. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Brent?
I ditto everything that Alan just said, and just to add to it, the only thing that I disagree with Alan is that it's not odd what you said about it being. Isn't it odd that they would encourage the children to feel responsible for the snail going extinct, but not for themselves? It's not odd when you consider what the objective is. It makes perfect sense with their objective, which is indeed to undermine the fabric of our system and of our society. What happens here is that, Stan, as much as it would be great if there was a formula, you can go in there and you could just wake somebody up. It doesn't exist. You can show them the door, they have to open it. You can lead the horse to water, you cannot make it drink. All that we can do, any of us, all of us, each of us, is to be who we are, honor the people that we are, honor our own perspectives, and then sow the seeds of those perspectives. Alan speaks out from his perspective. I speak from mine, you from yours, the chief from his. And each of us has value. And we can only have faith that some of the seeds we sow will bear fruit. There are going to be plenty of them that fall on dry ground and don't go anywhere. There are plenty of people who don't want to hear it. We can only hope and pray that enough people will hear it and will pick up the baton, if you will, pick up the message and carry it further to give us hope for survival and for a restoration of a proper United States of America, of a real free country and one with morals and standards. That's all we can do.
Well said, Brent. In fact, there's an old saying, and that is, I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And just because I cannot do everything, it doesn't mean that something I can do isn't important. And if everyone does something, then everything will get done. Chief?
Well, it's also important that people get praise for good things. It's a common, well, a lot of managers don't really know this, but it's the biggest motivator of employees is praise in front of other people. I think it's important for all of us to compliment everyone we know that's doing the right thing with their family in front of other people. Don't just take it for granted and you know a husband or wife or whatever is doing the right thing, say something about that in front of other people, and talk to all of your preachers and priests and encourage them to say the same thing at their services for the people that are doing the right thing with their families.
Well said and excellent. Now, there is an audio tape circulating around the internet. It's had 50 million listens. It's of a teacher in her class in, I believe, North Carolina.
Ooh.
And this teacher, whose name I don't know, I just call her Sally Stupid, is so far into the Obama thought process that she shows her lack of knowledge, she shows her lack of sophistication, she shows her lack of professionalism, she shows her Pelosi. That's Italian for her behind. And I'm sure by now all of you have heard it. Dr. Keys, have you had an opportunity to hear it?
Yes, I have.
Your thoughts?
I think that people have been watching it because they think it's bizarre and so forth. But I also, unhappily, Stan, think that if you think through seriously what's going on there, it represents the transformation of the classroom into what I think these people want it to become, a place of doctrination by intimidation that then imposes on the minds of students whatever is the straitjacket of political correctness that these people are trying to impose. And when we watch it, I think we ought to remember that though there's a sensibility still in our people that looks at this and sees something that shouldn't be going on, you do know that in all kinds of societies, not only in the old Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but still to this day in China and North Korea and places like this, this is commonplace. Because the idea that your thought is to be controlled and that therefore in your outward attitude you are not to question those who are identified with the offices of power, that is the bedrock underpinning of these societies. It starts out like this as something that seems weird and bizarre, but the fact that it is going on, we got some attention here, but how often is this happening in quiet and subtle and not so subtle ways when you don't hear about it and it just has its impact? And people just kind of choke it down, and though they'll think, oh, it has no effect on me and so forth and so on, in fact, I think it does. And little by little, an environment of repression builds in which people grow up in an environment and in schools where they fear to speak out, even when they are deeply convinced that it is the truth. So I think it's at one and the same time something that appears ridiculous and to be condemned, and you think, oh, everybody's going to see that. That's just thoroughly un-American to be teaching kids that you can't say a word of criticism about the president or some other politician, whoever it might be. But I think we're seriously entering into a world in which that's quietly a growing assumption. Final point. And if you think that that assumption only applies in the classroom, I think we ought to think back over the course of the last several years, Stan. Think about issues like, is Barack Obama a natural-born citizen? Where was he born, in fact? Things like this. Do you realize that throughout our so-called elite media, politics, judges, all of them, they were acting like people who had been raised in a system in which that kind of repressive intimidation had done its work, and in which they could not, on the basis of facts, question something where the question was even authorized by the Constitution? Part of it was, of course, I think, calculated because they want to destroy the Constitution's authority on the part of some of them. But on the part of others, it was just the effect of an environment of repression, of internal self-government in a bad sense that leads you to repress your love of truth and repress your respect for reason and repress your demand that the basic requirements of the rules of your society, like the Constitution, be respected. If power tells you to repress them, that's at work, and that it has already captured the minds of a significant portion of the elites in this society, and it shouldn't be at all surprising that in the institutions they dominate, like the education schools, you are now producing indoctrinators and wardens of the intellect rather than teachers.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Brent and Chief's feelings on this issue and more. So stay tuned to Talk to Solomon. Do you like to eat? I do. We all run to the store if we're hungry, right? Well, there are times when that doesn't work. And for those times, and it may be for an hour, and it may be for a day, and it may be for a week, who knows, God's in charge, you need to have quality food. Alpine Air, that's what this is, quality food. It has extended shelf life, and it tastes great. You should store what you eat and eat what you store. Just go to cpnlive.com, click on the icon for the Alpine Air foods. It's incredibly reasonable. It's actually a way to save money. Alpine Air has quality food that's going to be there when you need it. It's always better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Alpine Air at cpnlive.com. Click on the icon and protect your family. You have a computer, if you're alive today, which means you have a hard drive, which means it's going to break down. Mosey, the backup people, for thousands, for Stan, for thousands of people, for tens of thousands of people, is simply common sense. You go to cpnlive.com, click on the icon for Mosey, the backup people, and sign up. It's just a few dollars a month. Let me tell you something. We had a break-in. They stole our whole computer. You know what? When they take the computer, you can't recover anything, but we had Mosey. We had the backup. We were able to restore everything simply by buying another computer. cpnlive.com, click on the icon for Mosey, the backup people, and give yourself common sense, peace of mind, great value, the best thing you've ever done. Sooner or later, it's going to be Mosey, the backup people. I am holding in my hand a product. It's called TR10 Supercolloidal Silver. It's a natural antibiotic that works. You know, the reason we use silver to make cutlery, silverware, is because nothing grows on silver. It's the reason they put it in your teeth. It's the reason they use silver instruments to operate on the brain. TR10 is very inexpensive. Just go to cpnlive.com, click on the icon for the TR10, and order a quart. It's so inexpensive, it's really silly. But it's invaluable when you have a sore throat, when you have a cold, when you have something you're concerned about in yourself, your child, whether you have to spray it in your eyes or swallow it or put it on your skin, makes no difference. It's totally safe. It has less silver than is the safe level in drinking water, yet it's done in such a way that it does the job. A natural antibiotic, yours, TR10, supercolloidal silver, from cpnlive.com. Just click on the icon.